All right, well, our next session is the secret code of creation. This is my personal favorite. I hope you enjoy this. I remember years ago seeing the movie National Treasure, where Nicolas Cage finds a secret code on the back of the Declaration of Independence, and that was it was a cute movie. And that implied that there were some pretty brilliant people who had been able to place that code there. What if we found a code built into numbers? Numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. What if, analyzing those carefully, we found that certain sets of numbers have an incredible code built into them of immense beauty and complexity? What would that mean? I guess that would mean numbers have a pretty intelligent creator, and that's something we don't tend to think about. We think about God creating physical things, you know, the earth, the planets, the life forms on earth, the plants, the animals, human beings. We don't often think about God creating numbers. But he did in the sense that he's responsible for them. Numbers are a reflection of the way God thinks. And so we might expect as Christians to find a secret code built into numbers by the Creator himself. And there is such a code, and it's amazing. And it's amazing. But in order to understand what this means, we need a little bit of background information. And I liken this to the kind of meals I used to get when I was a kid. My mother's a wonderful cook. That every now and then she would supply something that I didn't really care for, like broccoli. Ugh. And I've warmed up to a little bit over the years, but I didn't like broccoli when I was a kid. And in rare moments of maturity, I would sometimes eat the broccoli first, get it out of the way, and then I could enjoy the rest of the meal, right? In that same spirit, we're going to do a little broccoli here first, okay? But stay with me because it's going to get really cool really fast. And I want you to understand what's happening. So we need to talk a little bit about sets. Now, a set is a collection of elements, in this case numbers, with a common defined property. And in most sets, some numbers are included in the set and others are excluded. And sets are pretty easy, really. You can define sets any way you like. Consider the set of even numbers. Some numbers would belong, others would not belong. These numbers would belong, right? And the others would not. So that's the set of even numbers. And you can tell it's even just because you know it ends in a, 0, 2, 4, 6, or 8, and it's even. We get that. Consider the set of negative numbers. Now that's a different set, and so it will contain different numbers. Some of them the same. Negative 2 is in both sets, right? But the others are not, and so on. So, and we can tell just by looking at it whether the number belongs, because we know what a negative number means. It'll have a little negative sign in front of it. So that's pretty easy. So some sets are very easy. You can tell just by looking at the number whether or not it belongs. Some sets are a little harder, like the set of prime numbers. You got to do a little work to figure out that. I mean, the first ones are pretty easy, but you got to do a little work to figure out the other ones. We're going to look at a set called the Mandelbrot set, and it is defined by this little formula, and you can't tell just by looking at a number whether or not it belongs to the Mandelbrot set. You got to run it through that little formula. And the number that you're checking to see if it belongs to the Mandelbrot set is the letter C, a lowercase letter C. Does not mean the speed of light in this talk. But that's just what we're using. That's the number we're checking to see if it belongs. And there's this other number, Z, which is there are actually many Z's, and each one has a little subscript. So we represent that by N. So there's a Z sub 0, there's a Z1, there's a Z2, there's a Z3, all the way up to Z infinity. There's a sequence of Z's. And depending on what number C you pick, the sequence of Z will either get really big or it won't. It'll stay kind of small. And if the sequence of Z stays small, let's say less than 10, then the number C is a part of the Mandelbrot set. Whereas if the sequence of Z gets really big really fast, then C is not a member of the Mandelbrot set. Okay, so, and that sounds very complicated. We'll do a couple of examples, and it's really very easy. You just need to do it. So let's check to see, is the number 1 part of the Mandelbrot set? So we're checking C equals 1. That's the number we're checking. So we're going to put that into the formula for C. So we have Z squared plus 1 is, and then Zn plus 1 means the next value of Z. So and the first value of Z by definition always starts as 0. So the first thing we're going to try is 0. And 0 squared, 0 times itself is 0, plus 1 is 1, yes. And so that's the new value of Z. So we add that to the list, and we plug it back in, and now we have 1 squared, which is 1, plus 1 is 2, right? That's our new value. We plug that back in. 2 squared would be 4, plus 1 would be 5, right? We plug that back in. 5 squared would be 25, plus 1 would be 26. Okay, you see what's happening there? We plug that back in. That gives you a big number, and so on. Now, we don't need to do any more than that because we can see what's happening. Is z staying small? No, it is not. It's getting big. So is the number 1 part of the Mandelbrot set? No, because the sequence got big. Okay? Let's do one more just to make sure we get it. How about -1? Is the number -1 part of the Mandelbrot set? So now c equals -1, we put that in. So now we're going to have z squared minus 1 is the new value of z. And we start with 0. So we have 0 squared to 0 minus 1 would be -1, right? We put that back in. Now -1 squared would be +1. Minus 1 would be 0. Well, that looks familiar. So we put that back in. 0 squared, wait a minute, this looks familiar. -1, 0, negative. Oh, that's interesting. It just bounces around between 0 and -1. Is z staying small? Yeah. So is -1 part of the Mandelbrot set? Yes. That's all there is to it. You can now check if any number belongs to the Mandelbrot set by running it through that formula. It's not hard. It's tedious, but it's not hard. There's one more complication, and then we'll get to the really good stuff. But you see in principle how it works. You test the number by seeing if the sequence of z gets big, in which case it's not a member of the Mandelbrot set, or stays small, in which case it is a member of the Mandelbrot set. There's one more complication. The Mandelbrot set also includes what we call complex and imaginary numbers. I hate that terminology because imaginary makes it sound like they don't really exist. They do exist, but an imaginary number is a number that when you square it, the result is negative. An imaginary number times an imaginary number is a negative number. And the sort of prototype imaginary number is abbreviated by a lowercase I, and by definition, I squared is equal to -1. And that's a little hard for many people to wrap their mind around because if you think about it, imaginary numbers can't be positive because a positive number squared is positive, right? Imaginary numbers cannot be negative because a negative number squared is also positive. And imaginary numbers are not 0 because 0 squared is 0. So how do we deal with this? How do we have a number that when you multiply it by itself, you get a negative? And that's a little hard to understand at first. That's a little perplexing to us. But if you think about it, when you were a kid and you were first exposed to negative numbers, they didn't make a lot of sense. Because you can say, I can have 1 apple or 2 apples or 3, and I guess 0, and I can imagine no apple. But how can I have less than 0 apples? Doesn't make sense. How can you have less than 0, right? That bothers kids because they don't have any experience with it. You get a little older, you get a bank account, suddenly negative numbers make a lot of sense, don't they? Yeah, I can't have less than nothing, amazingly. It's the same way with the imaginary numbers. They do exist despite the name. And by the way, to add insult to injury, the numbers that are not imaginary are called real. But that's just terminology. But they do exist. It's just we're not that comfortable with them because most adults never have a lot of experience with imaginary numbers because they're not used that much in most practical applications. They do have some. So how do we think of a number that's not positive, not negative, and not 0? Well, consider the number line. And so you have all the numbers there from negative infinity to positive infinity, right? 0 right in the middle. Now, numbers that are to the right of 0 are positive. Numbers that are to the left of 0 are negative. So we have a number that's not positive, it's not to the right of 0, it's not negative, and therefore it's not to the left of 0, but it's also not 0. Where would we put that? How about there? You can think of the imaginary numbers as being along a different axis. In fact, if you multiply the imaginary number I by any real number, you get another imaginary number. And so you have another number axis that's perpendicular to the so-called real numbers. That's the way I picture imaginary numbers. You can see they're not positive, they're not to the right of 0, they're not negative, they're not to the left of 0, and they're not 0 because they're not at that position. And so numbers are inherently two-dimensional. We can also have what we call complex numbers where you have a real component and an imaginary component. And we could represent the x position of that point with its real component and the y position with its imaginary component. And these are called complex numbers. It's one number, it has one position, but it has two parts. A real part representing the y position, the real part representing the x position, the position along the x axis, and then the imaginary part representing how far above or below the number line it is. Okay, so that's how you picture complex numbers. And that's a really useful thing because you can represent all points on a plane with one number that has two parts, a real part and an imaginary part. Very convenient. So the Mandelbrot set also includes these complex numbers. And what we want to know is there a pattern? Because you can't tell just by looking at a number whether or not it belongs. We tested the number 1 and found it did not belong to the Mandelbrot set, but -1 does. And we could check the imaginary numbers. You'd find 1/2 I does belong, but 2I does not belong. Is there a pattern? And so it occurred to people at some point, let's see if we can make a map of the Mandelbrot set. And this didn't happen really until 1978, and not in fullness until the 1980s, because it was that point that computers began to be fast enough to be able to check these points one after another very, very quickly. So what we'll do is we'll make a map, and we'll take all those points that do belong to the Mandelbrot set. We'll color them black. Remember, we checked -1 and how it bounced back, -1, 0, -1, 0. So -1 does belong because the sequence of z stayed small. Had we tried 0, we find it belongs to. You just get a sequence of zeros with that one. So z stays small. So all the numbers that do belong, color them black. And then we'll let the computer check the other ones because it's tedious for us to do it. But it's doing the same thing we did. It's running the numbers through that formula, and it's checking to see if z gets big or if z stays small. And if z stays small, we color them black. And after we plot in, we check more and more points, we start to see that there does look like there's some kind of pattern there, interestingly. So those are the points that do belong, some of them. And then points that don't belong to the Mandelbrot set, we'll give them another color, like red. Remember, we checked 1 and found that z gets really big really quick when you do 1, okay? So we'll color those ones red, and we'll have the computer check other points. And those ones all do not belong to the Mandelbrot set. And so we see a shape starting to emerge, a map of which points belong and don't belong to the Mandelbrot set. And as we do this over and over and have the computer do more and more points, the shape that emerges is this little interesting guy. Really strange shape, really strange shape. And no one was expecting this. This was a surprise that the Mandelbrot set, when you make a map of it, which numbers belong, so all the points in black. So now you can just look at it. You can see, does -1/2 belong? Yes, it does, because it's black. It's covered by the number axis, but you can see that's black. 1/2 I belongs because it's black. How about, you can do some off-axis ones, and you can see the number 1/2 does not belong because it's red. And I even shaded it so that if the sequence of z gets big quick, then I colored it a dark color. Whereas if it gets big, so it's not on the Mandelbrot set, but it gets big slowly, I gave it a brighter color like yellow. So it's shaded depending on so all the colored points are not on the Mandelbrot set, but depending on how fast the z sequence gets big, I shaded them. And so points that are very close to being on the Mandelbrot set, where z does get big, but it does so slowly, those have a very bright color. So bright colors are close to the Mandelbrot set, but not quite on it. Black is Mandelbrot set. And there you go. So now we don't have to run it through that formula. The computer's already done it. It's checked all those points, and we now have a map of which points belong to the Mandelbrot set. Now, the interesting thing is not so much that we have a convenient map, that is nice, but the map itself is fascinating. No one was expecting that when you made a map of which points belong to the Mandelbrot set, it would look anything like that. That's crazy, and it was something that no one was expecting. I'm going to remove the axes so you can see the entire shape there. That interesting shape, that's a map. All it is, a map of which points belong to the Mandelbrot set, plotted in what we call the Argand plane, with the real numbers along the x-axis, the imaginary numbers along the y, complex numbers off-axis. So the first shape you probably noticed, the biggest shape, is that heart structure that's called a cardioid. Now, a cardioid is what happens when you take a circle and roll it around another circle of equal size, keeping your pencil affixed to the same point on the moving circle. You see, cardioid. And you can see that is exactly the shape that the main lobe of the Mandelbrot has, cardioid. All the other shapes that you see on it, or the next shapes, I say, the next biggest ones, are perfect circles, and they are perfect circles. You can see that the circle that's branching off to the right, okay, that would be kind of to the left. Let's see here. Is it? Yeah, there we go. So that's the main disk. That's the next largest circle off to the left there. And then another one, and then another one on top of that. And then you have these other circles butting off there. So you have the cardioid, perfect circles, and then the other things you see are these little, I call them dendrites, these little antennae or spikes that come off the Mandelbrot set. And they're all squiggly except for this one, which is straight. That one goes straight out there. So that gives you a feel for kind of the overall shape of the Mandelbrot set. It's just wild that it looks like that. We can zoom in on certain sections of the Mandelbrot because we can have the computer check finer and finer resolution points. And when we do that, you can zoom in on the upper regions here, and we'll take a look at some of these dendrites. You might notice that the way they branch is interesting. This one right here, the largest circle on top, branches off into three, right? You have the trunk and then the stems there, right? So a total of three. So that's kind of interesting. The next one down on the left, the next biggest one, if you can count that, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5, like that. And then the next one is 7, 9, 11, 13. It knows how to add two to each number. So each one gains 2 new antennae. Kind of amazing. And then if you look on the right side, you get all the numbers, odds and evens. Interesting. And they go all the way to infinity, by the way. You can keep zooming in smaller and smaller, and they're infinite. There's an infinite number of these things. So they just increase the number of antennae that grow off of them. And I find this fascinating, too. If you take the 5 plus 3, that's 8. And lo and behold, that's exactly how many the one in between them has. And that's true of all of them. So the Mandelbrot set not only knows how to count, it knows how to add. And it doesn't matter which two. You take a big circle, the next biggest circle, and you look at the next biggest one in between them, it always adds the number of antennae. Kind of amazing. And so nobody was expecting that. Because how do you get addition and counting out of that little formula? That's wild. So really interesting, this shape. So again, we got the cardioid, you got the circles growing off of it, and you got the spike there at the end. And you might notice that at the end of that spike there on the left, there's a little black spot on there. We got to zoom in on that and see what that looks like. So let's see what happens. It turns out it's a baby version. Yeah. Isn't that wild? It's a baby version of the original Mandelbrot set. Almost identical in every detail. You got the cardioid, you got the circles growing off of it. The only difference is it's got extra stuff on the exterior. It's got little extra spikes growing off of it. We zoomed in on a spike, and the baby version has extra spikes. That might be significant. You might notice, too, that it has a spike on its tail, and it's got a little bump on that. What could that possibly be? Oh, it's another one. Okay, yeah. And now this one has even more spikes growing off of it, right? But otherwise, it's identical. And then we zoom in on that one. How about that? And you can do that for the rest of your life. They continue infinitely. There's an infinite number of baby Mandelbrot sets built into the original. Isn't that fascinating? And they just get smaller and smaller, and they get more spikes on the exterior. But take a look at how small that is compared to the original. Pretty amazing. And in case you're wondering, there's no bigger one. This is Adam. He's the first. He doesn't grow off of anything else. You can zoom out. There's nothing outside. But he has an infinite number of babies built into him. Pretty amazing. And you can, and by the way, a shape that does that, where it has smaller versions of itself built into it, that's called a fractal. So the Mandelbrot is one type of fractal. And it's not just the overall shape that repeats. When you zoom in on sections of it, you'll find that it kind of wiggles around and forms all of these interesting shapes. And the more you zoom in on it, they just continue. They continue on a smaller and smaller scale. It's actually infinitely wiggly, if that means anything to you. And you can zoom in forever. You think it's going to stop. It'll be smooth at some point. It doesn't. It's infinitely wiggly. And so you can zoom in on the wiggles till your heart's content, and it will never end. So pretty amazing. And just gives us a little window into the mind of God. Because I'm going to suggest that God is responsible for numbers and the laws of mathematics. And this gives you a little window into what he's thinking about when he thinks about math. So some of the interesting places to zoom in on, some of them have names, because mathematicians like to name these things. And so we're going to look at the Valley of the Seahorses. If you zoom in between the main cardioid and the main disc, and you go off to the right. And by the way, the colors are arbitrary, right? Other than by definition, by convention, I should say, we always color points on the Mandelbrot black. That's just a convention. But the other ones that are on the exterior, we can give them different colors, and so we'll change them from time to time to keep things interesting. But it's also conventional to make colors that are or points that are very close to being on the Mandelbrot set, brightly colored, and points that are farther away, darker color. So you can see that. The brighter blue is closer to being on the Mandelbrot set than the darker blue, which is further away. If you look on the right, it looks like seahorses, doesn't it? They're upside down. So that's the Valley of the Seahorses. So we look at one of these seahorses. It's quite beautiful, really. And again, the really bright points that you see are points that are very close to being on the Mandelbrot set. So what about this one? This one looks like it's really far away from the Mandelbrot set, doesn't it? But it can't be because it's bright. And so what that tells you is there must be a really thin black thread that stems off of here and wiggles around and makes all of these shapes. It's just so thin you can't see the thread. But there has to be one there, otherwise those points would not be bright. You see what I'm saying? So it's actually a very thin, infinitely wiggly thread that comes out and branches off and makes all those structures. It's just too small for you to actually see the individual thread. We just see the colors around it, the points that are very close. But we know they're close because they're brightly colored. So we've zoomed in by an enormous factor here that we're just we're just looking at a map of which numbers belong to that little formula. And the shape is amazing, just amazing. We'll zoom in here on the central hub of that. We get this kind of a spiderweb type structure. And I've found that if you zoom in on the center of that, you can do that forever, and it just goes on. It doesn't really seem to change very much if you zoom in on the center. So let's go off axis. I want to see what these spiderweb strands are made of. So we'll go off to the side here, and we find they're made of more spiderwebs, which is kind of wild. And we'll zoom in on that a little bit more. And you'll see now two central hubs, two spider webs, one on top, one on the bottom. And they kind of collide in the middle, and you get four. There's actually four little bright yellow spots there in the middle. And as we zoom in, it'll go from 4 to 8 to 16 to 32, 64, 128. Each one gets multiplied by 2. So the Mandelbrot set knows how to add, it knows how to count, it knows how to multiply, at least by powers of 2. If we zoom in on that central 4 that goes to 8 to 16 and so on, look what's in the middle there. Isn't that wild? And so again, we have a little baby version of the entire Mandelbrot set built into a very small, just one of the hubs of the central spider webs. And there it is. Amazing. And you'll notice it has a little spike and a little bump on the end of that, which of course is a baby version of that as well. But look how small this is compared to the original when we zoom back out. We're just zoomed in on one tiny little section of the spider web strand. And compared to the original, it's amazing. So it's just astonishing that such beauty could be built into numbers. But there it is. Go back to this valley. Now, we went to the right last time to the seahorses. If we go to the left, we have the valley of the double spirals. And so this structure right here, which I find immensely beautiful, is a double spiral, because if you follow this strand around like that, it'll go all the way around like that, you can see that there's another strand in between. So this strand is the same as that strand, but that strand is in between. And you see it goes a different way. It goes out that way. So it's two spirals that wrap around each other, a double spiral. And that reminds me of spiral galaxies, so I kind of like that, because spiral galaxies are double spirals, most of them. So, beautiful. What happens when we zoom in on that? Well, you can zoom in on the center forever, but let's go off axis to the sides here. It's stunningly beautiful. And there are these little structures here. I call them bow ties, right? It looks like a little bow tie there. You have two double spirals that kind of intersect in the middle. And there's lots of them. You can see them everywhere. Really beautiful. And again, you're just looking at a map of which points belong to that little formula. And it's beautiful. Who knew that math could be so pretty? Isn't that amazing? So we'll zoom in on one of these bow ties, and you can see it goes from the two hubs down to 4, and then 8, 16, and so on. And in the middle, you're not surprised this time, but there it is. There it is, little baby version. And again, you can see that the number of spirals goes, okay, so it was 2 to 4, and then this should be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. The next one right there, those would be 16. And the next one's there, 32, 64, and so on, all the powers of 2. Now, the equation we used was z squared plus c. Maybe that has something to do with the fact that we're getting powers of 2 here, right? But you see, again, a baby version of the Mandelbrot set. Notice it's flipped around. We zoomed in on a spiral. And so this thing has been rotated. It's been rotated many times. And so it doesn't have the same orientation as the parent because it's been flipped around. And on the exterior, remember when we zoomed in on the baby version and the spike, and it had extra spikes growing off of it? This time we zoomed in on a spiral, a double spiral. And lo and behold, the baby version has lots of double spirals growing off of it. So that seems to be a common feature of the Mandelbrot set. The baby inherits the properties of the section of the parent it grows off of, amazingly. Beautiful. One other valley we'll explore is the valley of, it's called the Valley of the Elephants, and it's the crevice on the main cardioid. This is the only symmetric valley in the Mandelbrot set. And the Valley of the Elephants, because it looks like a bunch of elephants marching one after the other, especially on the bottom row, because they're hanging from the ceiling on the top one. So there you go. Look at all those elephants with the trunks all curled up, right? And each one is standing on a circle, which is on another circle, and another one, right? And then it goes out and wiggles around and makes these elephant shapes. So we have, and by the way, you can go deeper and deeper into that crevice. There's an infinite number of elephants there. They don't stop. They just get smaller and smaller and smaller. And each one is standing on one circle. That'll be significant later. So one elephant on one circle, and there's an infinite number of them. They just get smaller and smaller as you go in, and their trunks get increasingly curled as you go in, which is kind of funny. So what happens when we zoom in on these guys? What do we see? Now this is a single spiral, so it's just one strand wrapped around itself. It's not two wrapped around each other. It's a single spiral. And again, you zoom in on the middle, and it looks that way. You can do that for all eternity. So we'll go off to the side, and again, you get these beautiful structures. Zoom in on them, you get some of these bow ties. But now the bow ties are made up of single spirals instead of doubles, so that's kind of interesting. And there you go. You zoom in on the middle of that. It goes from 2 to 4 to 8 to 16. Amazing. And then right in the middle, you get another baby version. How about that? And again, it's rotated around because we zoomed in on a spiral, so it got turned around a little bit. But isn't that amazing? Could you ever have grasped that when God was thinking about numbers, he had that in mind, apparently? And all revealed when we just run the numbers through that little formula and see which ones belong, see which ones the z stays small. It generates that shape. Amazing. It's mind-blowing to me. So that's the map of all the points that belong to that formula where z stays small when you run the number c through that formula. So it occurred to me, what happens if you change the formula? Because let's face it, you could spend the rest of your life exploring that shape. It's infinite. You can zoom in forever. And by the way, if you want to Google it, you can Google deep Mandelbrot zoom, and you'll zoom in, by a factor of like a Google. It's incredible. So you could spend the rest of your life studying that shape. But what happens if I change the formula? What if I do z cubed plus c? Well, amazingly, you get a different shape. And you could spend all your life studying that one, too. It's also infinite. We sometimes call this a multi-brot because it's a multiple of the Mandelbrot. Okay, so this is the first multi-brot we're going to look at. So it's just a variation of the Mandelbrot. The power's gone up by one. And it looks similar, but things have gone up by one. Remember, the original Mandelbrot had a cardioid, which has one valley. But the largest shape here is a nephroid. It has two valleys, one on the left and one on the right. So everything went up by one. We changed the power from 2 to 3, and everything went up. So yeah, it kind of makes sense. A nephroid is what happens when you take a circle half the size of the original and you roll it around the original. That's a nephroid. And you can see that's exactly the shape that you have here in this first multi-brot. In fact, I can change the formula gradually from from 2 to 3. I can make it 2.001, 2.002, and so on. And you can actually see how one shape morphs into the other. I thought this was kind of a neat thing to try. So you can see how the Mandelbrot kind of becomes the first multi-brot. So most things get doubled, right? That disc on the left of the Mandelbrot, it gets broken up and becomes two cardioids. Everything goes up by at least one. So the circles become cardioids, right? They gain a valley. A few things get multiplied by 4, including the baby Mandelbrot there on the end of the spike. If you watch it, it'll split into 2, and then it'll be joined by another one on the other side. So really interesting. The one thing that doesn't, let me back that up. The one thing that doesn't really change very much is the Valley of the Elephants, right? If you look at that crevice, that seems like it's the least changed. And so that made me wonder if the first multi-brot would also have a Valley of Elephants. So let's zoom in and find out. We'll zoom in on that valley and see if there's elephants there. And there are. Zoom in a little bit more. Elephants, there they are. Now the interesting thing is the circles have become cardioids. They've gained a valley, they've kind of bifurcated a little bit. And remember how in the Mandelbrot set, each elephant, there's one elephant on one circle, where here the circles have become cardioids, And now you have 2 elephants on a cardioid. The elephants have doubled, which is interesting because previously we had an infinite number of elephants, which means now we have twice that many. That'll keep you awake at night. And it's always the case, too, that the elephant in front, it has kind of a really smaller, it has a long trunk, and then the elephant in back is bigger but has a shorter trunk for whatever reason. And if we zoom on these, what are we going to see? Well, we see a single spiral, as we did before. Do you think we'll have those little bow tie structures? Let's zoom in and see what we see. The bow ties have become tri-ties or fidget spinners, I guess, maybe. So they gained an extra loop. So it's now the powers of 3. And when you zoom in, it'll go from 3 to 9 to 27. So it's all the powers of 3. So that the power does matter. It does exhibit mathematical properties. We'd expect that. And of course, when you zoom in on the middle, you have a baby version of the first multi-brot. So it also has an infinite number of baby versions built into it as well. Because if you think about it, this baby version has a valley of elephants. You could zoom in on it, and so on and so forth. So again, you could explore this shape the rest of your life, and you'd never even hit 1% of it, because it's infinite and beautiful. So that's z cubed plus c. Now I kind of want to know what the pattern is, right? So I tried other powers of z. So z to the 4th, and now I'm saying, oh, you know what? I think there's a pattern here, because the z cubed has kind of a 2-fold structure, right? One on the top, one on the bottom, kind of reflected about a mirror. Z to the 4th has a 3-fold structure, right? And so maybe the symmetry is 1 less than the power. So we go z to the 5th, yeah, you get a 4-fold structure. Z to the 6th, 5-fold structure. Z to the 7th, we get snowflakes. Neat. And if you zoom in on it, do you get baby snowflakes? You sure do. Quite beautiful. Then I tried negative powers. I wanted to see what happens there. So z to the negative 2. Now a negative power is just the reciprocal. It'd be 1 over z squared, right? And if you think about what that does, a reciprocal makes big numbers small and small numbers big. And so what it does is it flips the shape inside out. Remember, black belongs to the set, and color does not. It's black on the exterior now. Most of the universe belongs to this set, but just the interior doesn't. And it's kind of interesting, but even the interior is quite lovely. We'll zoom in on a section of this, and we'll find out, is this fractal? Now, unlike the positive multi-brots, the overall shape of this, that 3 structure, you can't find that inside. At least I haven't found it. But it does have a fractal nature to it. And it's quite stunning, I think. It has that pebble structure. And we zoom in on it. Is it fractal? It sure is. You can zoom in on that forever, and you find the same kinds of patterns that you do when you were zoomed out. Isn't that amazing? A little window into what it must be like to be able to think infinitely as God does. It gives us just kind of a glimpse into that. So let's try changing the power, more negative powers. So z negative 2 or z to the negative 3. So apparently the symmetry is 1 more than the number, right? So negative 3 gives us a 4-fold symmetry. Negative 4 gives us a 5-fold symmetry. So negative 5 gives us a 6-fold symmetry. So then we have another way to make snowflakes, but they're inverted snowflakes. So interesting. So, okay, what does all this mean? We're looking at a bunch of pretty stuff here. Is it all just sound and fury signifying nothing, or is there something to be learned here? What causes the beauty in fractals? How do we explain this? How do we explain their beauty? How do we explain the complexity that we find in it? The fact that they have baby versions built into them, and the more you zoom in, the more complex they get. That's the opposite of man-made machines. Man-made machines, you zoom in, and eventually you get down to, it becomes smooth at some point because we can't manufacture parts all that complex. Eventually you get down to atoms anyway. How do we explain this? Well, let's start with the first question. What causes the beauty in fractals? What are some possibilities? Some people say it's the man-made color scheme. Now, I said at the outset, by convention, we choose black to be points that do belong to the set, and you get to pick the colors for the exterior. And I've chosen what I think are attractive color schemes, but I could have picked other ones. So the colors I assigned. But based on the value, right, based on the rate at which z escapes to infinity. And so if we remove the colors, you can see the beauty's still there. And so I would argue it's not the man-made color scheme that gives it beauty. That's beautiful. The beauty's there. I think the colors enhance it a little bit, kind of the way salt brings out the flavor in certain foods, right? But the flavor has to be there to begin with, to be brought out. So it's not the man-made color scheme that helps, but it doesn't create the beauty. Did the computer create the beauty? No. Because remember, we did the first couple points manually. We could have done the whole set manually, just we'd be here all night, and then some, right? Because all the computer's doing is doing what we do quickly. And it doesn't mind doing that. It's a computer. It can do tedious things, and that's okay. So the point is, it doesn't matter which computer you pick. If you program it the same way and have it analyze the points, you're going to get the same graph. The computer didn't create that. The computer simply revealed it. The computer didn't create the beauty any more than a microscope creates bacteria. The microscope allows you to see the bacteria. The computer allows us to see these shapes quickly and zoom in on them, and because it can do calculations very quickly. Did people make this? Well, we did pick the formula, but one of the things we found is that when you change the formula, you still get beauty. So that's kind of arbitrary. Did we create the shape of the Mandelbrot set? No, we were surprised by it. The Mandelbrot set, by the way, it's named after Benoit Mandelbrot. He worked at IBM. He was a programmer, and he contributed a lot to these discoveries. He was as shocked as anyone else to find this incredible beauty in these maps of which numbers belong to a set. You wouldn't be surprised by something you yourself made, right? Build something and say, well, how about that? I had no idea it would turn out that way. That doesn't make any sense. People were surprised by that. And frankly, the kind of beauty that's built into this, we can't do that. We can make pretty things, but not things that are infinite. The beauty is somehow built into math, built into numbers, and revealed when we run them through that little formula and plot the results. It's been there since creation. It's just only been recently that we've been able to plot these things quickly using computers. What about the complexity in fractals? The fact that they have these interesting mathematical properties and the fact that they are infinite, they have baby versions built into them. What causes that? Is it something that the computer created? Well, no. Now, by the way, when these fractals were first discovered in the 80s, the Mandelbrot set, and they found the little baby versions, they thought maybe it was an error in the computer program that was causing these artifacts that are not really there. But mathematicians have now confirmed that these are real structures, that if you went and did it by hand, you'd get the same result. It's not an artifact of the computer. The computer didn't create it. It just reveals it, and it reveals it quickly, much more quickly than human beings can do. Did human beings create it? Of course not. We can't create something that's infinite. No human being sat down and decided, I'm going to make this heart-shaped structure, now I'm going to draw a circle next to it, and another circle, and I'm going to do this an infinite number of times. We can't do that. We can't make things that are infinite. So it's not human beings that are responsible for this, clearly. Did the formula create it? Well, we found that you change the formula. I mean, the formula is involved because we're running numbers through that formula to see which ones belong. But the formula itself, there's no reason to think that it would somehow create this complexity. It reveals it. It reveals the properties of numbers. And when you change the formula, you still get beauty and complexity. So apparently, the complexity is somehow built into math. So what is math? Well, the dictionary defines mathematics as the study of the relationship between numbers. And so when you understand how numbers, when you add this number to that number and get that one, that's a relationship, that's math. But then what are numbers? It's sort of weird because these things that we take for granted, we use numbers what's a number? We know what a number is, like 1, 2, 3, 4. How do you define it, though? Sometimes things that are the most basic to us are very difficult to define. I went through a number of dictionaries. About the best definition I could find for numbers is that numbers are a concept of quantity. I think that's the best definition that we can get to. So when you're thinking about the amount of things, the quantity of things that exist, that's a number. So what do 3 apples and 3 galaxies and 3 laws of logic have in common? Threeness, that quantity. So that's a number. Numbers are concepts, and as concepts, they're abstract in nature, not physical. Numbers exist in the mind. You can't actually see a number. And you say, well, wait a minute, I see the number 3 there. But that's not really the number 3. Because if it is, then I just destroyed the number 3. And students will now have to count 1, 2, 4, and so on. What a shame. No more threeness in the universe. No, that was a representation of 3, isn't it? Written numerals are not numbers. Written numerals are representations of numbers. Now, human beings invented numeral systems, and so we decided that the concept of threeness should be, should look like this. This is the symbol that we're going to use to illustrate that. And different societies represent it differently. You can express it in Roman numerals if you want. It's still 3. It's the same concept. It's just expressed in a different physical symbolism. So we invented the symbols, but numbers, we didn't invent numbers. They were already there. Laws of math are conceptual, aren't they? They exist in the mind. And that's interesting because that's going to prompt us to ask, where do laws of math come from? They exist in the mind. Did they evolve? So biologists like to explain the complexity in animals and plants by evolution. They would say, well, yes, it's very complex today, but it didn't start that way. It started very simple, and then over millions of years, it became more and more complex. Now that explanation doesn't work, but it's certainly, that's a non-starter with math. It's not like, it's not like numbers evolved, or it's not like 7 used to be 3, but then it evolved. That's absurd. Numbers have always been what they've been. They don't change. Mathematical relationships between numbers don't change, so they can't have evolved. It's not like laws of math started out simpler and they became more complex over time. No, they've always been what they are. The Pythagorean theorem has always been what it is, even before it was discovered. Were they created by people? No. Nobody sat down and said 2 plus 2, it really should equal 4. We discovered that. We found if you take 2 things and bring in 2 other things and count them up, the total is 4. Because if it was something we decided, we could decide it differently. And different cultures could have different laws of math. You could say, welcome to Australia. Here, 2 plus 2 equals 7. That's not going to work. If you have an architect that believes that way, don't hire him. They're not created by people. The notation, yes. But human beings have continually discovered new mathematical truths. We don't create mathematical truths. We discover them. The only thing we've invented is the notation and things like that. That's fine. But we didn't create laws of math. Do they come from the universe? Some people say that. They'll say, well, mathematics is a reflection of the way the universe is. Now, there is a connection between the physical universe and math. But math is not just a reflection of the way the universe is. Because, in fact, you can do things in math that don't occur in the physical universe. The physical universe has 3 dimensions of space, 1 of time, maybe some others if you believe certain quantum theories. But in math, you can have infinite number of dimensions. You can have what's called Hilbert space, which has an infinite number of dimensions. And you can calculate hypervolumes in these higher dimensions that don't exist in the physical universe. And it's meaningful and logical, even though it doesn't apply to the physical universe. And for that matter, things like imaginary numbers were discovered in math before anyone realized they had any application to the physical universe. It was only later that they realized you can use imaginary numbers in fluid dynamics in certain situations where the flow is 2-dimensional to solve the problem. They don't come from the universe. The universe, you zoom in on the universe, eventually you get down to the level of atoms and then protons and neutrons and quarks, and we think that's kind of it at that level anyway. It gets kind of fuzzy at that point. Math, you can zoom in forever. It's infinite. So I would argue that laws of math stem from the mind of God, and that makes sense because God's thinking is infinite, and so mathematics would be infinite. The number of numbers is infinite. The relationships between them, I would argue, are determined by the mind of God. If you think about what laws of mathematics are, laws of math like, I don't know, the Pythagorean theorem, for example, okay? That law is conceptual. It exists in your mind. You can't stub your toe on the Pythagorean theorem or accidentally swallow one. It's not physical, okay? You can write it down with a physical pencil, but the law itself is conceptual. It exists in your mind. Laws of mathematics are universal, meaning they apply everywhere, right? It's not like laws of math work in the USA, but in Europe, they don't work there. That'd be absurd. If they're universal, they apply everywhere. Laws of mathematics are invariant, meaning they don't change with time. It's not like, the Pythagorean theorem, it works on Tuesdays, but not on Thursdays, right? You have to apply a different law. No, it works all the time. It's always been that way. And they're exceptionless. It's not like the Pythagorean theorem works most of the times, but every now and then it fails. No, it always works. There are no exceptions to it in Euclidean geometry, of course. So laws of logic have these, laws of mathematics have these properties. And this makes sense if they stem from the mind of God. Because God's thoughts are conceptual. So if laws of mathematics are the way God thinks about numbers, they'd be conceptual, wouldn't they? See, I can have non-physical things in the Christian worldview because God is non-physical in the essence of his nature. He's not made up of atoms, okay? And God is omnipresent, so his thoughts would be universal. That's why laws of mathematics apply everywhere, because God's power is available everywhere. He is omnipresent. Laws of mathematics are invariant. They don't change with time because God doesn't. I, the Lord, do not change, therefore you, sons of Jacob, are not consumed, the Bible says. Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, today, and forever. God doesn't change with time. He's beyond time. He made time, so he doesn't change within it, and therefore his thinking in regard to numbers does not change with time. That's why laws of math will be the same tomorrow as they are today, and yesterday, and forever. And God is sovereign, therefore his laws of mathematics, there are no exceptions to them. There's no truth that's outside the mind of God. Everything that's true is in the mind of God and determined by the way he thinks. And so I, as a Christian, can explain the existence and properties of laws of mathematics, at least in principle. That doesn't mean I know all mathematical truth, only God does. But even I can explain that too. I can explain why God knows everything because his mind is infinite. But the naturalist has a problem. The naturalist who believes nature's all that there is, there's no God, or if there is a God, he's sort of within nature. He's not transcendent to it. He's got a problem. Because think about it. Laws of mathematics are conceptual. They exist in a mind. We know that. And laws of mathematics existed before people. So they're not the product of the human mind. But the naturalist has a problem, because if he's going to reject God, he's got a problem, because laws of mathematics, if they're a product of our mind, then they shouldn't exist before people did. But laws of math did exist before people did. We discovered them. We didn't create them. The way the planets orbit is described by Kepler's third law. It says that the period squared is proportional to the distance cubed. All the planets obey that law of mathematics. And they were obeying that law of mathematics before people came on the scene by 2 days, and in the secular view by millions of years. So you see, the universe obeyed math before people came on the scene. That's my point. And therefore, mathematics cannot be the result of a human mind, but the naturalist only has human minds, you see. It's a problem, isn't it? Not a problem for the Christian worldview, because I can have a mind before human minds, namely the mind of God. I can have a mind before the universe was created, the mind of God. So I can account for the success of mathematics, the fact that it applies to the physical universe and always has done so, the fact that human beings discover mathematical truths, we don't create them, and that explains why you can have math and planets obeying math before people came on the scene to discover those things. But the naturalist can't. Mathematics does not make sense in a secular worldview. It really doesn't. They use it, but they can't account for it. There's another type of fractal I want to talk about. The kind of perfect fractals that we've seen where they repeat perfectly and infinitely are only found in the abstract conceptual world of mathematics. You can plot them on a computer screen, but you can't see them in a telescope. On the other hand, there are physical approximations of fractals. There are things in the physical world that are kind of fractal. Now, they don't go forever, but they might go many times, where the basic shape repeats either exactly or approximately for a certain number of times. And one example of that would be snowflakes. Snowflakes have a fractal property to them. You zoom in on them, they still have that six-fold structure no matter how much you zoom in. These little gems from heaven that the Lord sends us from time, and we scrape them off the car. It's irritating, but they're quite beautiful, really, when you look at them under a microscope. They're little fractals. Amazing. That stuff that grows on your window in the winter, and it often forms a fractal property where it'll branch, and it'll branch into branches, and the branches will branch into smaller branches, and so on. So each branch kind of resembles the original structure. Quite lovely, really. So again, you can see the branches off of branches, and so on. Ferns, the way ferns branch is fractal. The overall fern looks like any one of its little side branches. So you get the main branch, then the branches out to the side, they branch out to the side, and they branch out to the side. Not infinitely, but for a number of times. I even found fractal broccoli. Yeah. So I guess broccoli is good for something after all. There you go. At least teach math with it. See that? It's cone-shaped. This is called Romanesco broccoli. It's cone-shaped, and you can see it's made up of smaller cones, which are made up of smaller cones, which are made up of smaller cones. You zoom in on it. Isn't that interesting? So there you go. The way coastlines fragment, they branch and branch into smaller branches and smaller branches and so on. It's fractal in nature. The way mountaintops branch into branches and so on. It's fractal in nature. The way clouds look. Am I zoomed in on a very small section of a cloud? Or am I looking at almost the entire sky? It's hard to know because the small section of the cloud kind of looks like the entire cloud. It's fractal. The way lightning branches is fractal. You got the main bolt, but each of the sub-bolts looks kind of like a smaller version of the main bolt, and they branch into branches and so on. It's really pretty spectacular when you think about it. And it's even more spectacular when you look at it in super slow motion. You can actually see the branching happening in real time until the leader connects, and then most of the current goes down the leader, which is pretty amazing, really, to think about it. I love stuff like that. So here's my question then. Why is it that fractals occur both in math, which is conceptual, and the physical world, which is not? Math exists in your mind. The physical world doesn't. So how does the physical world know anything about what's going on in your mind? Right? How does the physical world know to obey math? Why do we find fractals in both the physical world and mathematics? So that right there, that's a multi-brot that exists only in the conceptual world of mathematics. But that you can scrape off your cars in the winter. They look similar. They're both fractals, and they look similar. This particular shape, that's a section of the Mandelbrot set. It doesn't exist in the physical world, but that does. This particular shape, it may look like a plant. It's actually a mathematical graph. It's called a Barnsley fern. Each leaflet of this fern is the entire fern. Let me show you. Take the entire fern, and it's a leaflet of itself. Isn't that wild? You can do that forever. Interesting. But there are real ferns that approximate that, where each leaflet looks kind of like the entire thing. That's a mathematical graph. It doesn't exist in physical reality. But that does, grows on your windows. This is a mathematical plot of cones on cones. It does not exist in the physical universe. This, unfortunately, does. This particular shape, a double spiral, you can't see that in a telescope. That's a mathematical graph, part of the Mandelbrot set. But that you can see in a telescope. Interesting. Interesting. Why do fractals occur both in math and the physical world? Now, one answer to that, and it's a good answer as far as it goes, is that the physical universe obeys mathematical laws. Okay, so if fractals can occur in math and the physical universe obeys math, then occasionally you get a fractal in the physical universe. That kind of makes sense. But then that just kind of pushes the question back. Now I want to know, why does the physical universe obey math? Math's conceptual. It exists in the mind. The physical universe doesn't exist in your mind. So how does it know to obey math? How do we explain that? Well, in the Christian worldview, I can explain that, because mathematics is a reflection of the way God thinks about quantities, and it's God's mind that upholds creation, right? So, of course, you're going to have the physical universe obeying math, because it's controlled by the mind of God, and the mind of God thinks mathematically about things. So I can make sense of that. The universe is upheld by the mind of God. He upholds all things by the word of his power. It's his mind that controls everything, and his mind is mathematical. Makes sense. I can account for that, the success of mathematics in physics and things like that. But I would suggest to you, as secularists, cannot explain that, why it is that the physical universe obeys mathematical laws. There's no solution to that. They can't explain the properties of laws of mathematics, why it is that laws of mathematics don't change with time, why they apply everywhere, and so on, why they're exceptionless, why they're abstract. They can't account for any of that, why they existed before people, and they can't explain why the universe is compelled to obey mathematical laws, which apparently it is. So, and by the way, lest you think, oh, I don't know, certainly some of the smarter secularists have figured out a solution to that. They haven't. I want to show, there was this article written by Dr. Eugene Wigner. He was a PhD physicist and a Nobel Prize winner. This guy is brilliant, brilliant. But from his apparently non-Christian point of view, he tried to address this question of why is it that the physical universe obeys math. He wrote a wonderful article on this called The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Natural Sciences, where he ponders this philosophical question: why does the physical universe obey mathematical laws? It's perplexing from his point of view. He says it is difficult to avoid the impression that a miracle confronts us here, or the two miracles of the existence of laws of nature and of the human mind's capacity to define them. He's saying, it's amazing enough that the universe obeys laws. That's amazing. What's even more amazing is that we can apparently discover these laws. And they're mathematical in nature. They obey nice, neat little equations like E equals mc squared. That's awfully convenient. It's almost as if the universe was made to be at least partly understandable by humans. How do we explain that? Well, I want to give you the conclusion of his article. It's very honest. Here's what he says. Here's his conclusion. The miracle of the appropriateness of the language of mathematics for the formulation of laws of physics is a wonderful gift which we neither understand nor deserve. That's his answer. His answer is we don't have an answer. So we just hope it'll continue to work that way. Wow. And I'm not making fun of him. He's brilliant. He's a brilliant guy. He's won a Nobel Prize. That's not something I probably will ever do. He's brilliant. But my point is, from a secular standpoint, there is no answer to that question as to why the physical universe obeys math. And so whenever you see a snowflake, that is, if you will, proof of the biblical God. Because it's only in the Christian worldview we can make sense of why it is that the physical universe obeys mathematical laws. And therefore, fractals that occur in math can also occur in the physical world of atoms. So we've seen that beauty of infinite complexity is built into numbers. It's amazing. And when you plot certain sets, you get this beauty. Numbers are abstract conceptions of quantity. They exist in the mind. Concepts require a mind, of course. There needs to be a thinker to have thoughts. And numbers are a reflection, I would argue, of the way God thinks and the way we must think if we're going to be successful in God's universe. So God's mind determines mathematical laws. Our minds discover some of them. The secular worldview cannot account for the existence and properties of numbers or mathematical truths. It's not like they evolved. You can't play that card here. Math's always been the way it is. It doesn't change. Numbers existed before people, yet they're conceptions, meaning they require a mind. I can answer that. I have minds before people, the mind of God. Laws of mathematics are universal, invariant, abstract entities, and I can explain all those properties. That makes perfect sense in the Christian worldview. They're universal because God's omnipresent. They're invariant because God doesn't change with time. They're abstract because all thoughts are abstract, including God's. I can make sense of that in my worldview. The physical world contains at least approximate fractals. I can make sense of that too. But the secular worldview cannot account for why the physical universe obeys mathematical laws, and therefore why you can have physical approximations of fractals in the physical world. But I would argue the universe is controlled by the mind of God, and it's for that reason that we can do things like science. We expect to find patterns in nature because God has imposed order on his universe, and he's given us senses, and he's made us in his image, so we have at least some capacity for rational thought to where we can analyze the various options, choose the best because we're made in God's image. We can do science because the Bible's true. Now you say, but unbelievers do science. Yes, they do it because the Bible's true. The fact that they don't profess that is irrelevant. The only way they're able to do it is if the Bible's true. If God really is the way the Bible says he is, and if the universe is the way the Bible says it is. This presentation, we have this on DVD out there, The Secret Code of Creation, and on Blu-ray, because let's face it, those things are beautiful, and they deserve to be viewed in Blu-ray if you have one. Really pretty. And I'm very excited to say the book's out now. And the book is just, I explore some other issues in the book that I don't have time to do with this, but the super high resolution, beautiful color images in that. And by the way, the book, we also included software in the book. The software that I used to plot these, I wrote it. So I'm giving that to anyone who gets the book. You have that software. You can explore these shapes yourself. You can zoom in, and undoubtedly you'll see sections that I haven't seen yet because it's infinite. So you can discover things that no other human being has seen with that software and other software as well, including electronic pictures of the book. The neat thing about the program I wrote is any picture that is, any graph that's generated with it, you can come back to it later. You can save that as a JPEG or a PNG file, and then later you can drop it back into the program and continue where you left off, including all the images in the book. So you say, I would really like to zoom in more on that one. You can. You take the image of it, the electronic version on the CD, you drop it into the program, you can continue to zoom in on it, or change the color scheme or whatever you like. So that's just a fun resource. It's this universe, it's this abstract universe that the Lord is responsible for that was only discovered in the 1980s, and I want to share it with you because it's amazing. And you can explore that universe yourself. Again, the ultimate proof of creation, if you want a bulletproof argument for biblical creation, this is it. It's going to show you how to think and defend the faith biblically, the way Jesus did, the way the apostles did. Jesus was very good at debating. Have you noticed that? In his earthly ministry, when the religious leaders would try to trip him up, he always had a way to just turn it around on him. And if you thought, boy, I'd like to learn how to do that, that's the book. It's going to show you how to do that. We won't do it as well as Christ, but you can get better and better at it. And the DVD as well, Ultimate Proof of Creation. Understanding Genesis, which shows that, yes, the Bible really does indicate that God created in 6 ordinary days. There's no doubt about that when you follow the rules of hermeneutics, the rules of interpretation. And we have the DVD as well, showing how Christian doctrines go back to Genesis. Stargazer's Guide to the Night Sky, I mentioned that last time. I just wanted to point out beautiful full-color star charts on that. Want to know when the next meteor shower is, the next solar or lunar eclipse? It's in there. If you wanted to get a telescope, what kind you might want to get and how to use it, how to set it up. Just fun. I love getting out with a small telescope and just looking up. It's beautiful, and so I've poured my passion into that book. If you want one that's more of an apologetic resource, refuting the Big Bang in billions of years, it's Taking Back Astronomy. And the previous presentation I did as well, Astronomy Reveals Creation, we have that on DVD as well. And I do want to mention the physics of Einstein. I mentioned that earlier, but we talked about the one-way speed of light and things like that. That's hard to get, especially in a 15-minute segment of a presentation. But this book, Physics of Einstein, gives you enough background to understand that, the solution to the starlight problem, or at least a very reasonable solution, as well as other fun stuff. The physics of Einstein is awesome. It's just neat. You can talk about things like time dilation, time travel. Want to build a time machine? Yeah, there you go. There's some catches, though, to that. And black holes, things like that. That's a fun resource. We have lots of children's resources. I would encourage you to get those resources and children to get hammered with this. And we do have some packs, some children packs, too. And remember, you can get them from any of the tables there, and then the registers over on the side. Do remember you have a library pack. If you want to have an immediate creation library, get kind of the best of our resources for a 30% discount. That's a great way to do it. And do remember to sign up for our free monthly newsletter. It is free. There's no catch. We just want to bless you. So make sure you sign up for that. Put your email address legibly, or you'll get nothing, because it is an electronic newsletter. And not too many things free in this world, just salvation and our newsletter. So make sure you sign up for that. And do check us out on the web as well, Biblical Science Institute. We'll be back. I hope you're able to come back tomorrow night. I'll talk more about logic and the Christian worldview, and we'll do a little more with astronomy, too. A very visual presentation tomorrow night. I think it starts at 6:30 tomorrow night, right? 6:30. So I hope I'll see you there. Thank you very much. Have a blessed evening.